Greetings, Zimbabwe, Africa, and the world. Welcome to In Conversation with Trevor, where I go beyond the headlines and beyond the sensational. Today, I'm in conversation with Senator David Coltart, who is the Treasurer General of Zimbabwe's Movement for Democratic Change. Senator David Coltart, welcome to In Conversation with Trevor.
Thank you, Trevor.
Good. You love the outdoors. You love cycling. Do you still have time for that?
Well, one of the great things of losing the election in 2013 is it gave me a lot more time with my family and time to do things like mountain biking. So I took up mountain biking in 2014, and I've grown to love the sport. I get out to the Metopus pretty much every weekend, and even with the rigors of the current job, I'm determined to try and keep it up. But obviously I've had to cut back on the amount I do.
Is it with family, with friends, or just...
Well, my wife rides, so we ride together, but also I've got a group of friends, and we are an intrepid group. We go into the depths of the Metopus and Gulati communal lands, and I've discovered parts of Zimbabwe so beautiful that I'd never seen before.
Relaxing, isn't it?
Absolutely spectacular. Yeah.
You are a person of faith. You are a Christian. Tell me how your faith has informed your politics.
Trevor, I only became a Christian at university in 1981. I had a nominal faith before that, and coming to faith in 1981 had a profound impact on my outlook. The one central tenet of the Christian faith is that we are all fallen people. We all have our weaknesses. And so it helped me understand some of my own weaknesses, but also I think helped me to understand where other people were coming from. So it has a major influence on my life and certainly on my approach to politics. I believe that the Bible is an amazing guide for morality and is a very good guide to how nations should run and political parties should run.
So what are David Coltart's weaknesses?
Oh, you'd have to have my wife here to spell all of those out, but of course they are many. I tend to be rather bullish. A bull in a china shop sometimes. When I want to get things done, I become too determined and I don't always listen to people around me.
Is that a strength or a weakness?
One thing I say about everyone's character is that often you find two sides of the same coin, that a person's character strength is matched by a weakness. Right. So it can be a strength, but it can also be a weakness.
Your book, David, The Struggle Continues, 50 Years of Tyranny, for me, is required reading for every Zimbabwean. It tells the journey of tyranny in Rhodesia. It tells the journey of tyranny in Zimbabwe. It also exposes violence in ZANU-PF and violence in MDC. First of all, how have the sales been like of the book? The sales.
The sales have been amazing. My publisher said that if we sold 2,000 copies, they would be very happy. Right. That same publisher achieved sales of 10,000 books that they did for Ramaphosa. My book is sitting around about 7,000, which is a drop in the ocean if you're talking about book sales in America or Europe. But in a Southern African context, the publishers were very pleased. And it has been on bestseller lists on CNA and exclusive books. So I'm delighted with the sales.
And it gives us a picture of, talk to me about where you sit now, looking at the politics of the violence in ZANU-PF, the violence in MDC. With that experience of research that you did and what you're seeing right now, what's your takeaway? What are the lessons in terms of how the society moves forward?
Well, it's much deeper than obviously ZANU-PF and MDC, the reason the book is subtitled 50 Years of Tyranny is because, sadly, our country has seen decades of violence that go right the way back to the 1960s. And the RF and ZANU-PF were both guilty for the war and for the violence that afflicted our country in the 1970s. And tragically, that has left a very bitter legacy, which has continued in the 1980s and 1990s. And even the MDC, which has committed itself to being a non-violent democratic party, has caught a cold by sitting too close on occasions to ZANU-PF, which I believe is a fundamentally violent party.
So you have been accused of having been a police officer or of an informer. You deal with that in the book. And I want us to use this opportunity to address that issue right now. What's your position regarding that allegation?
So it's not an allegation, it's truth. I wasn't an informer. I was a regular member of the, as it was then called, the British South Africa Police. All white young men were conscripted, and I was no different. As a 17-year-old, I went in as a 17-year-old. Only for a few weeks I turned 18. And at the time, my parents tried to persuade me not to, but I was part of my peer group, and for the peer group, that was the right thing to do. It's something that I look back on with regret. I wish that I had taken the wise counsel of my parents, but many of us do things that we regret when we're 17 and 18-year-olds. Sure. I learned a lot from it. I think the best thing I can say about it is that I got a profound understanding that war was evil, and that propaganda can be used by old men to subvert young men for their own goals. And so it has left me with a deep-rooted commitment to nonviolence. And I believe in Zimbabwe that we simply have to draw a line in the sand on violence and move this country on.
The one thing that I found touched me a lot in the book is you relating the story of your family having to be moved from one place to the other, running away from escaping ZANU-PF operatives, CIO attacks and that kind of stuff. Given where we are right now, you continuing to be in politics, has the situation changed at all?
Well, personally, yes. My interaction, let me put it that way, with ZANU-PF goes back a long way. I was first threatened with arrest way back in 1989, soon after the Unity Accord. When there wasn't an MDC, I was representing ex-Zebra dissidents at the time.
Right.
But of course, in the early 2000s, and right the way up to 2012, I suffered 4 assassination attempts, 2 of which included my family. And those were shocking and terrible things to go through. I think with the loss of office and the loss of the election in 2013, perhaps it was felt I didn't constitute the same threat. And so that threat level has lessened. However, with my new office, we have heightened our security. We've seen recently that the attempt last week, for example, the abduction at the ZCC event, has been a warning to all of us that sadly perhaps that could happen again.
But have you been personally threatened?
I have not personally been threatened. I haven't had any threats since the last attempt on my life in 2012, when I was actually a minister.
I wouldn't. It wouldn't be right for me to depart from the personal story without saying you must be proud of what Doug Coltart is doing, following after Dad's tracks and doing amazing work.
I'm immensely proud of Doug. I'm very grateful for Doug, but for my entire family. We are blessed in a unique way in that at present all 4 of our children are committed to Zimbabwe, and we have 3 of our children in Zimbabwe, with our second son coming back to Zimbabwe next year. They They, like me, have a deep-rooted passion for the country. They have a deep-rooted faith in the future of this country. And I often say that, unfortunately, my generation, because of the war, because of white supremacy, because of discrimination and all the hurt that was brought about by my generation, there's a limit to what my generation can do. And I say to my children, it's your generation, actually, that I think is going to deliver the Zimbabwe that we all crave for.
Fascinated, David, by how, first of all, congratulations on the MDC Congress. I think it went well. Did it go well according to your expectations?
I was amazed, Trevor. You know, I've been out of the mainstream MDC for quite some time, going back to 2005, of course. And so I didn't understand how deep-rooted the mainstream MDC was. And the Congress at Gweru was heartwarming. We had 4,500 delegates, and these were poor people generally. They were people who came in buses, not fancy cars. Many of them slept out at night at Mkoba Stadium, and you know how cold Gweru can get. It can get really cold. I was born in Gweru, so I know. And the party was broke, so we couldn't provide food. And yet the resilience, the determination of those delegates was a sight to behold. So that was inspiring to me, deeply encouraging to me.
The other story is how a group of political leaders who had left MDC in a big huff managed to find themselves under the same tent. How was that done? What was the overriding interest that brought these people back again after having fought so much in public?
Well, I think Morgan Tsvangirai started that process. Certainly I, prior to his death, had very constructive interaction with Morgan Tsvangirai. I think that he realized after 2013 that unless he reunited the party, they weren't going to have a hope of winning an election. So he definitely started the process, but of course he was very ill and didn't have the energy to see that process through. Nelson Chamisa's strength is that immediately upon assuming office, he reached out to people. The day after he had that somewhat controversial election as leader, he phoned me, and we go back a long time. We go right the way back to 1999. And he said, you know, we've worked together well, David. I've got this new position. I want to reunite. Will you work with me? And he has been exceptionally proactive in reaching out to people like me, like Welshman Ncube and others. And so he deserves a lot of the credit for the reunification of the original MDC.
You say his somewhat controversial election. Do you want to expand on that?
Well, it was controversial to the extent that it was disputed. It was disputed by Toko Kupe. I don't really blame Nelson Chamisa for that. I think the problem was that the party had not amended the constitution. It was a mess. I think it was exacerbated by the fact that Morgan was so ill and terminal and literally didn't have the energy to sort out that mess prior to his untimely death. And that's what I mean by controversial. I think that now has been resolved. To the extent that Toko Kupe has had her own Congress and has her own party, and we have now had a Congress where Nelson Chamisa was elected overwhelmingly. So that's it's not ancient history, but it's history.
So I hear you giving lots of credit to Nelson Chamisa for the role in bringing the people together. But what about those other politicians that went away? Was this just the Nelson Chamisa factor, or there was something that made them want to come back together again?
Well, you know, we've been in the trenches for 2 decades. Welshman Ncube, Tendai Biti, Nelson Chamisa, we've been together in the struggle. And the split in 2005 was a gift to Robert Mugabe, was a gift to ZANU-PF. And, you know, as everyone says, with hindsight, you have 20/20 vision. Well, fortunately, we've got the hindsight, and we've looked back on that and recognized that we really needed to work through our differences. And that was a common understanding. There was a common understanding that divided, we would never be able to constitute a force against ZANU-PF.
So there's now unity within the party? After
Well, there's
Congress.
unity amongst those who participated in that Congress. Obviously, there's still division with some of our old colleagues, such as Toko Kope. But, yeah.
Help me understand there was a groundswell of support, when people went out protesting against Robert Mugabe to go. I think MDC did play a significant role in that. And one got the sense also that there was an expectation that something would come out of that would allow some form of GNU and so forth. Where did things change to get us to this place where we are, where there's polarization, where there's so much toxicity in the air?
I was not obviously privy to the discussions between Emmerson Mnangagwa and Morgan Tsvangirai immediately after the coup. What I'm told, and it's hearsay, so you have to treat it with caution,
sure,
is that Morgan felt that he had an understanding with Emmerson Mnangagwa that there would be some, if not a GNU, some understanding that there would be a progression towards constitutionalism, respecting the rule of law. And the feeling is that after Morgan's death, that some of those understandings were not fulfilled. And when the time when I started to doubt the good faith of Mr. Mnangagwa was, for example, in February last year, when he appointed a person I didn't feel was the best person to be appointed as chair of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. And unfortunately, it's gone downhill since then with the events of August, well, with the election itself, the way in which it was conducted, and the events of August and January this year.
I'm wondering, given clearly the immense personal sacrifice by senior members of MDC to come together to bring a united MDC, could the same effort not be applied in bringing about national dialogue in this country?
Well, I think, what has happened with the MDC post the Congress is that some people like myself and Welshman Ncube and Tendai Biti have come back into the mainstream MDC. And if you look, for example, at Welshman Ncube's history, you will see that he is a moderate person. He's always been tempered in his language, and he is committed to constitutionalism, to respect for the rule of law, and for a peaceful process. I stand for the same things. So what the public need to understand is that there is a consensus actually within this new MDC that we are committed to trying to stabilize the country and to take the country through to meaningful dialogue. What we believe, though, is that the playing field is uneven at present. We think, and I think we're justified in thinking this, that there are two dominant political parties in the country. That's borne out by the election results, and two dominant political leaders, Emmerson Mnangagwa and Nelson Chamisa. That's borne out by the results. That's not to say that other players can't have a seat at the table, but in reality they are not the powerful political players. They don't deliver massive constituencies. And so the dialogue has to be primarily between those two parties and between those two leaders. But it cannot be a warped dialogue. It has to be, as I say, on an even playing field. And both of the protagonists, I think, need a neutral interlocutor who can ensure that there's fair play, a neutral referee or umpire, so to speak.
So you do believe there is scope for dialogue?
There has to be scope, Trevor. When we look at the chaos our country is facing, and more than that, the suffering of people. Your driver, when I came here today, was telling me, it's costing him $16 for a loaf of bread if he can find it. And he was saying, as a driver, he's really battling just to get bread. And that is the plight of people right across our country. And so when poor people are battling to find bread, there is an obligation on political leaders to put aside their personal preferences and ambitions and work in the best interests of the nation.
So you speak of an interlocutor, level playing field. And I can sense from what you're saying, David, that you truly believe that dialogue should happen, that it's important. Why can't we, what will it take for us to get to that space?
I think first of all, it takes genuineness. Leaders, if leaders are engaged in smoke and mirror games and are not genuinely interested in stabilizing the country and respecting the Constitution, it's very difficult for dialogue to take place. I think secondly, everyone has to be committed to constitutionalism, to respecting the Constitution, and to implementing the Constitution in letter and spirit. And of course we could spend this entire interview discussing what that means. But those two issues are fundamental. Then there has to be respect. There has to be mutual respect. You know, one of the things that's bogging the prospect of dialogue down is the issue of legitimacy. And Nelson Chamisa and the rest of us contest that election result, and indeed
even after the Constitutional Court
even
has
after
made a ruling.
As a lawyer, I had major problems regarding the process employed by the Constitutional Court, and obviously I'm biased. But neutral lawyers would say the same thing.
How would we deal with, I'm trying to pursue the issue of dialogue. How do we deal with the issue of legitimacy so that it isn't the stumbling block that it appears to be towards dialogue?
So I think that both leaders have to park that issue. In other words, Emmerson Mnangagwa mustn't be insisting that he be recognized. And Nelson Chamisa must say, look, I dispute that, but I'm going to park that issue in the national interest so that you can get on to the substantive issues. Because if both leaders stand on their respective positions, it's going to be very difficult for dialogue to proceed.
Okay. Let's move on to the issue of, very sad issue of August the 1st, 2018. Where we had loss of life, innocent lives lost. What was your understanding of what happened, what should not have happened around those sad events?
Well, I think it goes back to this deep-rooted problem in our nation, which goes way beyond Emmerson Mnangagwa, Constantino Chiwenga, and all the other major actors in that decision. Unfortunately, violence has become our default.
On both sides, David?
Well, I think that that's a false equivalence. Okay. I think for example, if you read the recent book published by Stuart Doran, Kingdom, Power and Glory, which looks at the dispute between ZAPU and ZANU-PF, which started in the 1960s, continued in the 1970s and the 1980s, you can see that violence is a part of the ZANU-PF culture. Violence was employed against ZAPU in the 1983s. If you look at the Hansard debates, for example, in January 1983, you can see that some of the statements made by ZANU-PF leaders then against the likes of Edward Ndlovu and Sidney Malunga is very similar to some of the statements that we see being made by ZANU now. So I think it's a false equivalence to say that ZANU-PF and the MDC are equally violent. As you know, in my book, I write about it in 2005. One of the primary reasons why I couldn't stay within the MDC was because I could see that there was a danger that people were flirting with a violent route. And I didn't want to have anything to do with that. In fact, the reason I've come back in is on the back of undertakings given to me by Nelson Chamisa, that he is committed to non-violence. And even with things, here we are in August, and as we know, there are marches that are planned. What we've said, what I have said within the narrow confines of the MDC, is that we need to be disciplined. We need to ensure that whatever we do uses non-violent methods, so that we express ourselves, express our constitutional rights, but don't allow violence to become a factor.
Thanks for watching. Don't want to miss out on these insightful conversations? Subscribe to our YouTube channel.